At my son's wedding, the bride sat me in the kitchen. I was the one paying for the entire six-figure event, and my seat was next to the dishwashers. I just smiled, stayed quiet, and pulled out my phone. They thought they were getting an inheritance. Instead, I gave them a lesson. By the time the cake was served, their perfect day had turned into a nightmare they would never forget. Before I continue, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Like and subscribe if you've ever had to draw a line with family who thought your kindness was a blank check. My name is Samuel Miller. I'm 67 years old, and for 40 of those years I built houses. I know about foundations, about stress points, about the slow, invisible rot that can bring a structure down. I never thought I'd have to apply those lessons to my own family. It all started a week before the wedding, in a room that smelled of leather and expensive air freshener. The office of the venue coordinator. I sat on a chair that was more art than furniture, while Ashley, my son's fiancée, pointed at things in a binder. Her finger, with its perfectly manicured nail, tapped on a picture of a towering ice sculpture. "And we absolutely need this one, Sam," she said, her voice sweet as honey. She didn't call me Dad. She hadn't since she realized my bank account was more useful to her than my fatherly advice. "It'll be the centerpiece of the cocktail hour." The coordinator, a young woman with a practiced smile, typed something into her computer. The number on her screen climbed higher. "And the premium champagne upgrade?" Ashley asked, glancing at me. "It's what my parents served at their anniversary. It's tradition." I looked at the final bill she pushed across the polished desk. $115,000. We had agreed on 80. I felt a familiar tightness in my chest. I thought of my late wife, Carol. We had married in a courthouse with 2 friends as witnesses and celebrated with pizza and cheap beer. Carol used to say, "A wedding is a doorway, not a performance, Sam. It's about what's on the other side." I had promised her I would give our son Dan a beautiful wedding. But I also remembered her final warning whispered in the quiet of a hospital room. "Don't let him mistake your kindness for a bank vault, Sam. Teach him the value of $1. Dad can handle it, right?" "Dad." Dan's voice chirped from Ashley's phone on the desk, weak and entitled. I pulled out my credit card. The one I'd saved for emergencies, for a new roof, for the quiet peace of a debt-free retirement. Ashley beamed. "Oh, thank you, Sam. You're the best." She squeezed my arm, a brief, performative gesture, before turning back to the coordinator to discuss lighting options. I signed the receipt, my hand steady, a habit forged from 40 years of holding a hammer and a trowel. But inside I felt a foundation crack. The rehearsal dinner was held at a steakhouse where the menus were as heavy as tombstones and didn't list prices. The air smelled of seared meat and money, a combination I had learned to associate with my son's new life. We sat at a long table draped in white linen. At the head of it, Ashley's parents, Gerald and Patricia, presided like monarchs holding court. Gerald, a man who sold complex financial instruments to people who didn't understand them, laughed loudly at his own jokes. Patricia, wearing a string of pearls that looked heavy enough to be an anchor, sipped her Chardonnay and passed judgment on everything her eyes touched. I sat quietly, a ghost at the feast. I had worn my best suit, the one I bought for Carol's funeral. It felt out of place here, too honest for the room. Gerald turned to me after a long story about closing a deal in Scottsdale. "Sam, what was it you did again? Construction, right? Something with your hands." He said the last words with a slight pause, as if describing a curious, primitive craft. "I built things," I said, my voice even. "Things that last." How admirable, Patricia chimed in, her smile not reaching her eyes. "It must have been such unpredictable work. Dan is so fortunate to be in a more stable field." I looked at my son. He heard them. I watched him take a slow sip of his beer, his eyes fixed on the centerpiece of roses. He didn't defend the hands that had paid for his business degree, the hands that had built the very deck he'd get married on. Instead, he just smiled weakly and changed the subject. "So, Ashley, did you confirm the car service for tomorrow?" Each jab, each moment of his silence was a small, sharp blow. I felt the memory of my own hands, the calluses that had never quite faded, the scar on my left thumb from a slipped saw in '98. Those hands had worked 60-hour weeks, so this boy could have a life without splinters, without the ache that settles deep in your bones after a day of labor in the cold. And now he watched silent as his new family dismissed that lifetime of work as something quaint and faintly embarrassing. Towards the end of the meal, after the crème brûlée was served, Ashley rose from her seat and glided over to my side of the table. She placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch felt like a business transaction. "Sam," she began, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that drew the attention of everyone nearby. "Can I borrow you for a second?" She led me to a small alcove near the entrance, away from the table but still within view. Her face was a mask of sincerity. "Tomorrow is going to be so wonderful, but so hectic," she said, her eyes wide. "And you're the only one I can truly rely on. You have such an incredible eye for detail." I waited, knowing the real purpose of this performance was about to be revealed. "I was hoping," she continued, leaning in closer, "that you could be our special liaison tomorrow. Just for the reception. To keep an eye on things in the kitchen, make sure the staff is on schedule, that the courses are coming out perfectly. You'd be saving our special day." There it was. The demotion gift-wrapped in flattery. Father of the groom had been downgraded to unpaid event staff. I looked past her shoulder and met Dan's eyes across the room. He was watching us. He knew what she was asking. And as I watched, he gave her the smallest, almost imperceptible nod of approval before turning away to laugh at something Gerald said. That nod was the final piece, the confirmation. This wasn't just Ashley's plan. It was theirs. I looked back at her smiling, expectant face, and I did something I had been practicing for years. I smiled back. A calm, pleasant, agreeable smile. The smile of a man who understands his role. "Of course, Ashley," I said, my voice betraying nothing of the cold fury solidifying in my chest. "I'd be happy to help. Whatever you need." She squeezed my arm, relieved. "I knew I could count on you." She thought she was assigning me a role in her perfect production. She had no idea she had just handed me the script to a different play entirely. And in my version, I would be the one directing the final act. The ceremony was beautiful. It was held in a garden overlooking a small lake under a flawless June sky. Ashley looked stunning. Dan looked nervous and proud. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, I felt 100 voices scream inside my head, but I stayed silent. This was his choice. This was the life he wanted. The guests began to move toward the grand ballroom for the reception. Music from a string quartet drifted through the air. I could see the arrangements of peonies and white roses I'd paid for artfully placed on every table. The ice sculpture Ashley had insisted upon sparkled near the entrance. I had paid for all of it. Every chair, every flower, every note of music. As I made my way toward the entrance, Ashley intercepted me, her white dress rustling. She linked her arm through mine. "Sam, darling, this way," she said, her voice sweet. She didn't lead me into the ballroom. She led me past it toward a set of swinging doors. "We've set up a special spot for you right here," she said, her smile never faltering as she pushed one of the doors open. A blast of heat hit me along with the shouts of chefs, the clatter of plates, and the sizzle of grease. She pointed to a small stainless steel table in a corner next to a stack of dirty bus tubs. "It's so much quieter back here. You can be our man on the inside, make sure everything runs smoothly." The doors swung open and then slammed shut, trapping me in the chaos and leaving the music and laughter on the other side. I stood there for a moment. The anger didn't come. The pain didn't either. What came was a cold clarity, a stillness in the center of the storm. I looked through the small porthole window on the door. I could see my son raising a glass of premium champagne, his face flush with a happiness built on my quiet humiliation. I didn't feel rage. I felt like an engineer. A problem had been defined. The variables were clear. The solution was waiting to be built. My eyes scanned the kitchen past the chefs moving with organized efficiency. And then I saw it. Pinned to a corkboard next to the industrial dishwasher was a sheet of paper. The bold print at the top read, "Wedding schedule and vendor contacts." Every name, every number, every scheduled payment was there. The band, the open bar, the flowers, the late-night food truck. I took a slow, deep breath. The air was thick with the smell of garlic and effort. Ashley had given me a role, and I was about to perform it perfectly. I sat at the small steel table, an island of quiet purpose in an ocean of noise. The air was a thick soup of garlic steam and the sharp metallic smell of a grill working too hard. A chef shouted something in Spanish to a busboy, who hurried past with a clattering tower of dirty plates. The dull roar of the industrial dishwasher provided a constant churning soundtrack. This was my son's wedding reception. My seat. My hands were steady. I pulled my phone from the inside pocket of my jacket. The screen's cool blue light felt like a tool from another world. My thumb moved with a certainty I hadn't felt in years. First, a text message to a number I knew by heart. Frank. The message was short, a code we'd established decades ago on construction sites when things were about to get complicated. Code read, "Stand by." His reply was almost instantaneous. "Copy that. Awaiting instructions." I closed the message and opened a password-protected folder on my phone. The label was simple D. Carter Wedding. Inside were the PDFs of every contract, every invoice, every agreement I had signed. I had read every line of the fine print. I always do. It's a habit that has saved me from bad deals and bad partners my whole life. Tonight, it would serve a different purpose. My son and his bride thought my money was a blunt instrument. They didn't understand that in the right hands, it could be a scalpel. The first call was to the band. Through the porthole window, I could see them on the stage playing a soft jazz number, providing the elegant background noise Ashley had insisted upon. I found the number for the band leader, a man named Mitch. He answered on the second ring, his voice slightly muffled by the music. "This is Mitch. Mitch, this is Sam Miller," I said, my voice calm and low. "I'm the payer on file for the Carter wedding. Hey, Mr. Miller, everything sounding good out there?" "It sounds fine," I said, "but there has been a change of plans. I need you and your band to finish this current set, take your scheduled break, and then quietly pack up your equipment and leave." There was a moment of confused silence. "Leave? But we're contracted until 1 a.m. "I'm aware," I said, "and you'll be compensated for the full evening. In fact, I'm authorizing an immediate transfer of your remaining balance plus a 20% bonus for your discretion and your trouble." I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. The calculation was simple. Less work, more money. Okay, Mr. Miller. It's your party. The check clears, we're ghosts. The transfer is being initiated now," I said, tapping my banking app. "You'll have a confirmation in 60 seconds. Consider us gone," he said, and the line went dead. One down. The next call was to the bar manager, Javier. I watched him through the window, expertly pouring a glass of the premium scotch I was paying for. "Javier, Sam Miller. We have a change to the bar service this evening. Mr. Miller, is everything all right?" "Everything is proceeding as it should," I said. "Effective at 10 p.m. in approximately 15 minutes. The open bar service is terminated. You will switch to a cash-only basis for all guests. Sir, your contract is for a full open bar until midnight. There's a substantial penalty for early termination." "I am aware of the penalty," I said, cutting him off gently. Please add it to the final invoice along with a generous tip for your staff's professionalism this evening. They shouldn't be penalized for this." He was quiet for a beat. "Yes, sir. As you wish." 2 down. The third call was the most important. It was to Angela, the owner of the flower shop. She was a sweet woman who had cried with me when I'd ordered the arrangements for Carol's funeral. "Angela, it's Sam Miller. Sam, I hope everything is beautiful over there. We sent our best peonies. They are beautiful, Angela. So beautiful that I've decided they're wasted in that ballroom. I have a change of plans for the main arrangements, the large ones meant for the cake table and the entrance." "A change, yes. I need your driver to come back to the venue at 10:30. I want him to pick up those arrangements and deliver them to the Cedar Crest Nursing Home on Elm Street. The dedication card should read, 'In loving memory of Carol Miller.'" Her breath caught. "Oh, Sam, that's a lovely thought." "Carol would have preferred it," I said. And it was the truest thing I'd said all day. She believed flowers should be for people who need to see something beautiful, not just for people who can afford them. "I'll have my driver there at 10:30 on the dot," she said, her voice thick with an emotion that was blessedly genuine. 3 down. The last 2 were easy. A quick call to the livery service to cancel the vintage Rolls-Royce scheduled to pick up the happy couple at 1 a.m. Another to the trendy taco truck I'd been forced to book for a late-night snack. Both calls were the same. "Yes, I understand the cancellation fee. Please send the invoice." I put my phone back in my pocket. The whole operation took less than 12 minutes. Through the porthole, the party was still in full swing. The band was starting their last song. The guests were laughing blissfully unaware. Dan and Ashley were moving through the crowd, accepting congratulations, performing the role of a couple deeply in love and destined for a life of effortless grace. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is a messy, hot emotion. This was engineering, a controlled demolition of a structure built on a faulty foundation. The dominoes were set. All I had to do now was wait for the first one to fall, and I knew the sudden, total silence of the music would be the finger that pushed it. From my vantage point at the small steel table, I watched the party through the porthole window on the swinging door. The air around me was hot and smelled of burnt butter, but my mind was cold and clear. Outside in the world, I had paid for the band was finishing their first set. The final smooth notes of an old Sinatra song hung in the air for a moment, and a smattering of polite applause followed. Then something shifted. Instead of putting his guitar on its stand and heading for a glass of water, the lead singer Mitch began unplugging his amplifier. The drummer, a young man with a bored expression, started loosening the wingnuts on his cymbals. A low murmur rippled through the ballroom. Guests exchanged confused glances. A woman in a blue dress whispered to her husband, who craned his neck to get a better look at the stage. The elegant hum of the party began to falter, replaced by the awkward sound of a question mark hanging in the air. I saw Ashley notice first. Her perfect hostess smile wavered just for a second. Her eyes narrowed. She nudged Dan's arm with an urgency that was anything but festive. They began to move across the dance floor, trying to look casual, but their steps were too quick, their shoulders too rigid. I leaned closer to the window, an unseen spectator at my own play. "Hey, Mitch, what's going on?" Dan asked, trying to sound friendly and authoritative at the same time. "You guys just taking a break, right?" Mitch, a man who had likely seen 100 weddings unravel, simply shrugged. He didn't look angry or apologetic. He looked like a man who had been paid for a job. "Evening's over for us, folks," he said, his voice calm and professional. Ashley's face tightened. "What do you mean over?" "We have a contract until 1 a.m. "That you did?" Mitch said, nodding politely. But the gentleman paying the bill canceled the remainder of the performance. He gestured vaguely at his phone. The cancellation clause was executed perfectly. "We've been paid in full plus a generous bonus for our trouble. As far as we're concerned, the contract has been honorably fulfilled. Dan's face went from confused to flushed in a matter of seconds. The gentleman paying... Who authorized this? I'm the groom. Mitch picked up his guitar case and gave a small non-committal shrug. He pointed a thumb over his shoulder directly toward the kitchen doors. The father of the groom, he said, his expression neutral. He seemed to know what he was doing. Wished you a very happy marriage, by the way. He turned his back and continued packing his gear. The rest of the band followed his lead, moving with the quiet efficiency of men who were happy to be heading home early. I watched the color drain from Ashley's face. Dan just stood there, his mouth slightly open, looking from the empty stage to the kitchen doors and back again. The silence that followed was heavier and louder than any music. It wasn't empty space. It was full of sudden, sharp speculation. The polished, joyful performance of their perfect wedding had just been interrupted by a technical difficulty no one had anticipated. The guests stood in awkward clusters, their conversations now hushed, their eyes darting between the stage and my son. The party wasn't a party anymore. It was a scene. And from my seat in the kitchen, I felt a deep, cold calm settle over me. It was the clean, quiet sound of the first domino falling exactly as I had placed it. The silence the band left behind was a strange, heavy thing. For a full minute, no one seemed to know what to do. The elegant choreography of the party stalled. Conversations that had been flowing like wine now sputtered and died. Guests stood in awkward clusters, their smiles frozen on their faces. The only sounds were the clinking of ice in glasses and a rising tide of confused whispers. Then, as if guided by a single primal instinct, a drift of people started moving toward the bar. When the music dies, you seek alcohol. It's an old rule. From my post in the kitchen, I had a perfect view of the long, polished mahogany bar. I watched as Javier, the manager, spoke quietly to his two bartenders. They nodded, their faces impassive. Professionals. They knew how to handle a sudden change in the weather. A man in a tuxedo, someone I vaguely recognized from Dan's off-fuss, approached the bar with an easy confidence. "Macallan 18 neat," he said. The bartender nodded, poured the scotch and set it down. "That will be $35, sir." The man froze his hand halfway to the glass. "Excuse me, put it on the wedding tab." "I'm sorry, sir," the bartender said, his voice polite but firm. "The open bar concluded at 10 p.m. We are cash or credit only for the remainder of the evening." The man stared, fumbled for his wallet, his face turning a shade of red that clashed with his bow tie. He paid, took his drink, and retreated to his table, where I could see him recounting the story to his wife, whose eyes went wide. But the main event was still to come. I watched as Gerald Ashley's father strode toward the bar with the self-assured swagger of a man who believes his presence is a form of currency. He clapped a hand on the shoulder of a friend. "Javier, my good man," he boomed, gesturing to his group. "Another round of the good stuff for my table. And let's get another bottle of that Veuve Clicquot flowing." He gave a dismissive wave. "Just put it on the family tab." Javier, who had been waiting for this moment, stepped forward. He wiped the counter with a clean cloth. "My apologies, Mr. Jones," he said, his tone perfectly deferential. "But the bar service has been switched to cash or credit only per the event payer's instructions." Gerald's smile faltered. "Event payer. I am the father of the bride. Don't be ridiculous. Put it on the main bill," Sir Javier said, and his politeness was a fortress. "My instructions are very clear. The main bill for the open bar was closed by Mr. Miller at 10 p.m. I cannot reopen it without his direct authorization." The small crowd around the bar went silent. Gerald's face darkened. He looked around, suddenly aware of the audience. "This is an absurd mistake," he said, his voice a low growl. He pulled out his own credit card and slapped it on the counter. The sound was too loud. The news spread through the ballroom like a virus. "It's a cash bar. Can you believe it?" The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a chilly, judgmental awkwardness. The illusion of effortless, boundless hospitality had been shattered. I watched as the bartenders discreetly removed the half-empty bottles of premium liquor from the top shelf. The champagne flutes on the tables remained empty. A six-figure party, and it was brought to its knees by the simple, unbreakable rule of commerce: someone has to pay. Across the room, I saw Dan and Ashley. They were surrounded now not by well-wishers, but by guests with questions in their eyes. Ashley's face was pale, her smile a brittle, painted-on thing. Dan was shaking his head, trying to explain something he clearly didn't understand. The music had been the first domino. The liquor was the second. I knew which one would be the third. It would be my son turning his eyes, finally finding the porthole window of the kitchen with a question that was already turning into an accusation. The swinging doors to the kitchen burst open with a force that made a stack of clean plates rattle. Ashley came first, her face a mask of furious disbelief, the silk of her expensive dress seeming to carry the tension of the entire room. Dan was right behind her, red-faced, his tie slightly askew. The noise of the party followed them in for a second, before the doors slapped shut, trapping us in the humid, chaotic heat. "What did you do?" Dan's voice was a choked accusation. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "The band. They're leaving. They said you told them to." I was sitting at the small steel table, a forgotten corner in their grand design. I picked up the glass of water a busboy had left for me and took a slow, deliberate sip. The cool liquid felt good against my dry throat. I set the glass down with a soft click, the sound barely audible over the hiss of the fryers and the clatter of pans. "I'm just doing the job I was given," I said, my voice calm. The calmness seemed to make them even angrier. "What job?" Ashley snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "What are you talking about?" I looked at her, my expression unreadable. "You put me in charge of the kitchen. You made me your special liaison. You told me to make sure everything runs smoothly." I let the words hang in the air, her own sweet, condescending phrases coming back to her in this hot, greasy room. "Well," and I continued, "I took a look at the budget, and I made some executive decisions to prevent any overages." I picked up my phone from the table and turned the screen toward them. I had the emails opened in a neat row. The band has been paid in full as per their cancellation clause. They were very professional about it. The bar service has been adjusted. The penalty fee for that will be on the final invoice. "And the flowers?" I paused, letting my eyes meet hers. "The main arrangements are on their way to the Cedar Crest Nursing Home. A donation in my late wife's name. Carol would have liked that." Ashley stared at my phone as if it were a snake. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Just then my phone began to ring. The caller ID read Tito's Tacos. I smiled faintly and tapped the speakerphone icon. "Yeah, this is Mike from Tito's Tacos." A cheerful voice crackled through the speaker. "Just calling to confirm the cancellation for the 11 p.m. service at the Carter wedding." Dan stared at the phone, then at me, his face a mixture of rage and utter helplessness. "That's confirmed, Mike," I said clearly. "Thank you for checking. Please send the final invoice to the email on file." "You got it, man. Have a good night." The line clicked off. Before Dan or Ashley could find their voices, the kitchen doors swung open again. This time it was the wedding planner, a frantic young woman named Jessica. Her hair was coming loose from its elegant bun, and her eyes were wide with professional panic. "Mr. Miller, what is happening?" she said, her voice a high-pitched whisper. "The band is gone. The bar is refusing to serve the premium liquor, and some of the guests are asking for refunds on their wedding gifts." Ashley let out a small strangled gasp. I looked from her pale face to my son's clenched fists. I felt nothing but a cold, hard sense of balance being restored. "Jessica," I said calmly, "I've simply made some budgetary adjustments. The event was running a little rich for my blood." "You're ruining everything," Ashley finally cried, her voice breaking. "This is my wedding day." Stood up slowly from the steel table. I smoothed the front of my jacket and looked at her not as a father, but as the man who had signed the checks. "No, Ashley," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying over the kitchen noise. "I'm not ruining it. I'm paying for it. And the person who pays the bills gets to read the ledger." I walked past them toward the swinging doors, leaving them standing in the wreckage. "Now, if you'll excuse me," I said, pushing the door open into the sudden shocked quiet of the ballroom. "I believe it's almost time to cut the cake." The wedding planner, Jessica, her professional smile now looking strained, clapped her hands with a forced cheerfulness. "All right, everyone. If I could have your attention, it's time for the bride and groom to cut their beautiful cake." A smattering of applause followed, weaker this time, as guests turned toward the small circular table that had been wheeled to the center of the dance floor. The cake itself was a magnificent 5-tiered creation, a testament to the thousands of dollars I had spent on it. But it stood alone, stark and isolated. The table around it was painfully bare, a gaping hole where $1,000 worth of peonies and cascading roses were supposed to be. The photographer hovered his camera, raised, a confused expression on his face. Is this the final setup?" he whispered to Jessica, who just shook her head, looking helplessly toward the kitchen. I watched Ashley's face through the porthole window. Her porcelain composure was cracking. Her eyes darted from the bare table to the whispering guests, and for a moment I thought she was going to cry. This wasn't the picture she had planned. This wasn't the image she had curated for her friends, for social media, for the life she so desperately wanted to project. Dan, seeing his new wife's distress, moved into action. He grabbed a microphone from the empty stage. "Hey, everyone," he said, his voice a little too loud. "Thank you all so much for being here. We've had a few minor logistical hiccups this evening, but that's what happens at a live event, right?" He attempted a laugh, but it came out as a nervous cough. The room remained silent, watching him. "But the most important thing," he stammered. "The most important thing is our love, and sharing this moment with all of you." It was painful to watch. He was improvising, trying to patch a hole in a sinking ship with words that meant nothing. That's when the kitchen doors swung open. I walked out. Not with anger, but with the calm, deliberate pace of a man who knows exactly where he is going. I was holding the second microphone. Every eye in the ballroom turned to me. A hush fell over the room, so complete I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. I stopped a few feet from the cake table. I didn't look at Dan or Ashley. I addressed the guests. "Excuse me for interrupting," I said, my voice clear and steady. "I just wanted to offer a point of clarification." I saw Dan's face pale. Ashley's hand went to her throat. Due to some unforeseen reallocations in the event budget, I continued using the cold, impersonal language of business. A few services for the remainder of the evening were adjusted. The live music, the premium open bar, and certain floral arrangements were deemed non-essential to the core mission of this event. A collective gasp went through the room. I let the statement hang there for a beat. However, I said, and my tone shifted just slightly, "I want to assure you all that the saved funds have not simply been pocketed. They have been redirected." I looked toward the main entrance of the ballroom and gave a single sharp nod. The doors opened and my old friend Frank walked in. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo, just a simple, clean suit. He was carrying a giant ceremonial check. The guests turned, murmuring, completely baffled. "Tonight we have a special guest with us," I said into the microphone. "I'd like to ask Dr. Annabelle Reed to please stand." From a table in the back, a woman in a simple blue dress stood up. It was the director of pediatric cardiology at the local children's hospital, a woman I had called that afternoon. I turned to face my son. My late wife Carol believed a wedding should be the start of a legacy of love and generosity. She believed that the best way to celebrate a new family is by helping another one. I gestured to Frank, who walked the giant check over to Dr. Reed. The photographer, sensing a real moment, began snapping pictures, the flash of his camera illuminating the stunned faces in the crowd. In her honor, I said, my voice ringing through the silent ballroom, and to begin my son and his new wife's marriage on a foundation of what truly matters. I am pleased to donate the entirety of the evening's savings, $75,000, to the Children's Hospital Cardiac Surgery Fund. The room was silent for a count of 3. Then one person began to clap. Then another. Within seconds, the entire ballroom had erupted in thunderous applause. They weren't clapping for the wedding anymore. I looked at Dan and Ashley. They were frozen statues at their own banquet, their faces a canvas of shock and utter humiliation. The perfect day they had built on my back had just collapsed into a story that was no longer about them. I set the microphone down on the empty cake table. I gave a polite nod to Dr. Reed and Frank. And then, without a single glance at my son, I turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving them to stand in the warm, bright spotlight of a charity I had created in their name. The room was silent for a count of 3. It was the kind of absolute stillness that only follows a great shock, a moment where 100 different minds are all trying to process the same impossible fact. The photographer stood frozen, his camera lowered, forgotten. Then, from a table near the back, a single person began to clap. It wasn't the polite, scattered applause from the ceremony. This was different. It was solid, appreciative. Another person joined in, then another, until the entire ballroom was filled with a wave of applause that was not for the bride and groom, but for the quiet, gray-haired man who had just dismantled their entire performance. I saw it all from the stage. I saw men in expensive suits nodding with grim respect, their wives whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting between me and the couple by the cake. The judgment in their gazes was a quiet, sharp thing. They weren't just watching a family drama. They were witnessing a public correction. I looked at Ashley's parents. Gerald and Patricia were frozen in their chairs at the head table. Gerald's face, usually flushed with self-importance, was a blotchy, pale mask. Patricia's hand was clutched at her throat, her pearls suddenly looking like a noose. The grand social event they had bragged about for months had just turned into a public humiliation. But my eyes were on my son. Dan looked like a man who had just watched his own house burn down. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving it pasty and slack. He stared at the giant check in Dr. Reed's hands, then at me, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. This wasn't a temporary problem. This was a permanent stain. And Ashley. Her mouth was slightly open, her perfect makeup suddenly looking like a fragile, cracking shell. The bride at her own wedding, the star of her own show, had suddenly become a villain in a story she didn't write. The foundation of her perfect day, built with my money and cemented with my silence, had just been reduced to rubble. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel glee. This wasn't a victory lap. It was a controlled burn. I had set a fire to clear away the rot, but the smoke still stung my eyes. I thought of Carol, of how she would have hated the spectacle, the public airing of our family's failure. But she would have understood the necessity. She would have known that some foundations are too rotten to repair. They must be torn down and rebuilt from scratch. I gently placed the microphone back on its stand. I gave a single respectful nod to Dr. Reed, who nodded back, her eyes full of a quiet understanding. Then I turned. I did not look at Dan. I did not look at Ashley. To look at them would be to engage, to invite a response, to continue a conversation that was for me finally over. They were no longer the center of my world. They were just two people left standing in the consequences of their own choices. I walked off the small stage, not quickly, not slowly, but with the steady pace of a man who has finished a long day's work. The guests parted from me as I walked, their eyes following me with a mixture of awe and pity. I kept my gaze fixed on the grand double doors at the far end of the ballroom. As I passed their table, I could hear Ashley let out a single sharp sob. I didn't turn. I pushed through the doors into the cool, quiet air of the evening. The sound of the party, the applause, the shocked whispers all faded behind me, The performance was over. They had wanted me to disappear from their perfect day. In the end, I was the one who walked away free, leaving them to stand alone in the wreckage. I had given them exactly what they asked for. I didn't go back to the wedding. I didn't need to. I drove home the streets of our quiet town, dark and empty, the houses lit with a warmth that felt like it belonged to another world. The silence that greeted me when I walked through my own front door wasn't the lonely quiet I'd grown used to. It was a clean silence, a settled silence. It was the sound of a long, painful chapter finally coming to an end. I made a cup of coffee, the simple ritual of scooping the grounds and pouring the water, feeling steadying and real. I sat in my old armchair, the one with the worn spot where Carol used to rest her head, and let the quiet of the house settle around me. My phone, which I had placed on the small table beside me, began to buzz. It was a volley of angry texts from Ashley. They were a messy, chaotic mix of outrage and disbelief, accusations of cruelty, of public humiliation, of ruining what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. She called me a monster, a bitter old man. She said I would never be forgiven. I read them once, then set my phone face down on the table. Her anger was her own storm to navigate. I had no intention of standing in the rain with her, but from Dan there was nothing. A profound, echoing silence that was in its own way louder than all of Ashley's furious words. Was it shame? Was it fear? Or was he simply calculating his next move? I didn't know. News like that doesn't walk, it runs, especially in a town this size. By the next afternoon, I knew the story of the wedding gift, as someone had already nicknamed it, had made the rounds. An old acquaintance from the hardware store sent a text that just said, "Wow." That evening, the sound of Frank's old pickup truck rumbling up the driveway was a welcome intrusion. He didn't knock, just walked in the back door the way he has for 30 years, a six-pack of beer in his hand. "Heard you threw one hell of a party," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He set the beer on the kitchen counter and twisted the cap off 2 bottles, handing one to me. We sat on the back porch, the cool evening air settling around us. The sky was a deep star-filled blue. So Frank said after a long, comfortable silence, "You actually did it." I took a slow sip of my beer. It tasted clean and cold. "It wasn't a party, Frank. It was a demolition." He nodded, looking out at the dark silhouette of the oak tree in my backyard. How does it feel? I thought about that for a moment. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a hot flash of victory, but it wasn't there. "I don't feel triumphant," I said honestly. "There's no real joy in it. It just feels necessary. Like resetting a bone that's been allowed to heal wrong for years. It hurts, but you know it's the only way it'll ever be strong again." Frank grunted in agreement. "Sometimes a foundation is so rotten you can't just patch it. You gotta tear the whole damn thing down to the studs." "This was never about revenge," I said, looking at my hands. These hands had built things my whole life. They knew the difference between creation and destruction. Revenge is an ugly, messy business. This was a correction, a lesson in respect that was long, long overdue. We sat there for another hour talking about everything and nothing. The failing engine on his fishing boat, the way the winters were getting warmer, the good old days when a man's word was his bond. We didn't mention Dan or Ashley again. We didn't have to. After Frank left, I stood on the porch alone. The house was quiet again. I looked up at the stars and thought of Carol. She would have hated the public spectacle, but she would have understood the need for a firm foundation. She knew better than anyone that love without respect isn't love at all. It's just a habit. And I had finally broken it. The war wasn't over, but the most important battle had been won. Not against my son, but against my own silence. The weeks that followed the wedding were quiet. Not the heavy silence of waiting, but the clean, empty quiet of a slate that has been wiped clean. The angry texts from Ashley stopped after the 3rd day. The rumors, I'm sure, continued to circulate in the social circles she and Dan cared so much about, but they didn't reach my front porch. My world had become smaller and blessedly peaceful. Frank came by on Sundays. We'd sit on the porch, drink a beer, and talk about the things that old friends talk about. The mysteries of a failing carburetor, the stubbornness of weeds, the quiet satisfaction of a well-organized tool shed. He never asked about Dan. He didn't have to. He knew I'd tell him if there was something to tell. And for 3 weeks, there wasn't. Then on a Tuesday afternoon, a car I recognized pulled up to the curb. It was Dan's expensive sedan, the one I had helped him buy. He didn't get out right away. He just sat there for a long time, staring at my front door, as if he were trying to solve a complicated math problem. When he finally emerged, he wasn't the same man I had seen at the wedding. He looked thinner, the expensive suit he wore now, hanging a little loosely on his frame. There were dark circles under his eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. He walked up the path with a hesitation I hadn't seen in him since he was a boy. I opened the door before he could knock. He looked startled for a second, then his shoulders slumped in a gesture of weary defeat. I didn't say anything. I just stepped aside and gestured toward the kitchen. He followed me, his footsteps hesitant on the hardwood floors I had installed myself 20 years ago. I put the coffee on. It's what I do. It gives a man's hands something to do when his heart doesn't know its next move. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same table where he'd done his homework as a kid, the same table where Carol and I had paid our bills for 30 years. He just stared into his empty cup for a long time, as if the answers were written at the bottom. "Ashley's gone," he said finally, his voice raspy. "She left last week. Packed her bags and went back to her parents. Said she couldn't handle the humiliation." I just nodded, pushing a cup of black coffee toward him. The calls stopped coming in. He continued, his voice barely a whisper. "The investors, the friends. Even Gerald and Patricia won't answer my texts. It's like a switch was flipped. One day we were the center of everything, and the next, we're ghosts." He finally looked at me and his eyes were hollow. "We're drowning in debt, Dad. The vendors from the wedding, the credit cards, the loan I took out for that last venture. It's all coming due. The bank called yesterday about the condo." He took a shaky breath. "I let her convince me that the image was everything, that your money was a resource, not a gift. I thought if we looked successful, we would become successful. I was weak, and I was a fool." He looked down at his hands, which were trembling slightly. He was finally being honest, and in that honesty there was a profound and terrible pain. "I'm not here for money," he said, his voice cracking on the last word. "I know I don't have the right to ask you for a single thing. Ever again." We sat in silence for another minute, the only sound the slow, steady drip of the coffee maker. This was it, the crossroads, the moment I had both dreaded and, in a strange way, hoped for. He said, his voice breaking. "I don't know what to do. For the first time in my life, I don't have a plan. I don't know where to even start." He looked up, and for the first time in 20 years, he looked at me not as an obstacle or an ATM, but as his father. "I came to ask for your advice, Deho." The request hung in the air between us, fragile and real. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow sip of my coffee, giving his words the weight and respect they deserved. I saw the ruins of the life he had built, the shame, the fear. But I also saw something else, something new, a flicker of humility. A man stripped of his pride, left with nothing but the truth. "The first step," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "is to stop performing. Stop trying to look like the man you think you're supposed to be, and just be the man you are right now. A man in a deep hole." He flinched, but he nodded. "Get a job," I said. "Not a career. Not a venture. A job. Something with a paycheck you can hold in your hand. Something that makes you tired in a way that has nothing to do with shame. "No one will hire me now," he whispered. "I have a friend," I said. "Frank's old buddy runs a logistics company out by the airport. They're always looking for people who can show up on time and lift a box without complaining. It's hard work. It's third shift. It doesn't come with a corner office or a fancy title." He looked at his own hands, the smooth, uncalloused hands of a man who worked with spreadsheets, not steel. He looked like he wanted to argue, to say it was beneath him, but the fight had gone out of him. He just nodded again, a slow, painful gesture of acceptance. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was just a foundation. And for the first time in a long, long time, it felt like one we might actually be able to build on. I looked at my son, the man sitting across from me, broken and lost. The anger in me had cooled, leaving only a quiet sadness. It would have been easy to write a check to solve this with money the way I always had. But that would just be another delay, another painkiller for a sickness that needed a real cure. "I'm not going to give you a financial solution," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm going to give you a path." I reached for my wallet, but not for cash. I pulled out an old, slightly worn business card and slid it across the table. Dan stared at it as if it were a foreign object. "The first step is to stop performing," I said. "Stop trying to look like the man you think you're supposed to be, and just be the man you are right now. A man in a deep hole. Get a job," I continued. "Not a career, not a venture, a job. Something with a time card and a real paycheck." The card was for an old friend who runs a logistics company out by the airport. They don't care what you wear or what car you drive. They only care if you show up on time and can lift a box without complaining. It's hard work. The shift starts when other people are sleeping. It doesn't come with a corner office. Dan picked up the card, looking down at his own soft hands, the hands of a man who worked with spreadsheets and faced a future of handling boxes. He didn't argue. The fight had gone out of him. I wasn't fixing his life. I couldn't. But I had given him the tools to start fixing it himself. After Dan left, holding the business card like a map to a world he'd never known, I stood in my quiet kitchen for a long time. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, catching dust motes dancing in the air. I walked over to the mantel and looked at the photograph of Carol. She was smiling that smile that always seemed to know more than I did. And in that moment, I felt I had finally honored her memory. Not by giving our son everything he wanted, but by giving him the one thing he truly needed, a chance to become a man on his own. It was an expensive lesson bought with heartbreak and silence. But maybe, just maybe, it was the only foundation strong enough to build on. True fatherhood isn't just giving your children what they want. It's providing what they need to build their own character. Sometimes the greatest gift isn't a blank check, but a firm boundary and a path toward earning their own way, even if the lesson is painful. What did you think of my decision? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe for more.